We'll never forget September the 11th, 2001, the day in which this world changed for all Americans. It was the day the Twin Towers in New York City were attacked with airplanes flying into the Twin Towers and eventually causing them to destroy and fall to the earth. I was called by the American Red Cross as a volunteer mental health worker to go and to spend some time in New York City after the tragedy happened. I want to share some of those stories with you. I remember getting on the plane in Atlanta. When I got on that plane, it was the same type of plane that had been flown into the Twin Towers. And the passenger next to me was from New York City and knew people who had been in the towers and killed. She also went to church with Father Michael, the fire chaplain who died in the debris. I want to take you through some of the stories. Each one was different. As a disaster mental health worker, I was sent to Staten Island, Center number 6. It was a Catholic monastery retreat. We worked there for several weeks. And the population we worked with was varied. Some days we worked mostly with limo drivers. Other days it was firemen, or maybe policemen, or maybe workers that had been in the tower. I remember working with one woman who told the story of how she had gone to work that day, riding in on the train as she always had, except this day would be different. She noticed right before she got downtown in New York that there was smoke coming from one of the upper floors on the Twin Towers. Just as she noticed the smoke, the train went into a tunnel. Coincidentally, she had been talking on the phone with her fiance, who was back at her apartment trying to get her son ready to go off to school for the day. But he was watching the television to see what was going on. And once they lost cell phone contact, he saw the second plane hit the second tower. They were out of communications for 20 to 30 minutes. In fact, the train was stopped underground and wasn't able to move. When they finally were able to move, she came out on the other side and she noticed people jumping from the Twin Towers to their death. It was pandemonium. She said a construction worker came and pushed her head down and said, "You don't want to see this." She was a runner, and she, like everybody else, tried to get away. She heard the buildings come down, and like everyone else, she and her companions in terror that day were covered with that ash that so many pictures have shown. It filled the streets, it filled their nostrils, it filled their lungs. But still trying to get away, they ran down until they came up against a fence. And she was ready to climb the fence and jump into the water and swim to the other side just to find safety. But she wasn't able to do that because, as someone pointed out to her, she'd never make it because she couldn't breathe because of all the dust that had caked her mouth, her nose, and even into her lungs. It wasn't long until they saw a ferry come by. They jumped into the water and the ferry pulled everyone on side, inside the boat. On the other side, they were horrified by the cameras that were everywhere, wanting to know what was going on, how they felt. She finally found someone she knew from her building, and they walked off in silence. Meanwhile, her fiance and her son didn't know what had happened. It was hours before they were able to contact each other because cell phone towers were down. I remember spending the day talking with her about her ordeal. But that was just one day. Another day I talked with this lady in Tower 1. She had been working in her office, one of the floors above 100. She said she felt the building sway when the plane hit. rocking back and forth, and immediately got up to go to the elevators, but the elevators weren't working. So the next thing she did was go back to her desk, and her mind shut down. She told me how she remembered that she was taking off nail polish, just the mundane, because she couldn't handle the reality of what was going on in her world. Finally, she was escorted down the fire escape, spending over 5 hours just to get outside the building. There's story after story. You see, we set up on Staten Island. I'd never been to Staten Island. It was on one night that we took the Staten Island ferry, and I drove by or rode by on the ferry and saw the Statue of Liberty for the first time in my life. But I was struck how in the background you could still see the smoke, yet weeks after the bombing had taken place. Smoke coming from Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan. I remember the story of a man who had been trapped in the basement of one of the Twin Towers. He told how that he had all the keys to all the doors and all the buildings, but he said there was no building. On another occasion, we talked with firemen, and they told how their battalion chief had died and his widow was promised money from the Red Cross, but no check ever came. When we finally traced it down, we found out that that check was in a post office that had been quarantined because of an anthrax scare. Story after story came back. Each one horrific. Each one with people trying to build their own lives. I remember on my day off going down to Ground Zero as close as you could get before the barricades would stop you and the police would let you go no further. And I saw that banner that the workers had hung on another building in the distance. And that banner said, "We will never forget." We can't forget. Our nation was changed forever that day, on September the 11th, 2001.